Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz, and I'm recording this on the 1st of January 2024, which is actually the 4th anniversary of Scally-Daddling About the Books as a channel. So I should be kind of celebrating that with a few bells and whistles, but for reasons that I've explained in a community post, that hasn't been possible because it's been a tricky late December. But I have been reading all the way through December, and I'm going to, here I am with my pile of books to do a sort of a December wrap up at the least. So I finished 11 books in December, and it was quite an exceptional month in reading terms, because none of these books was less than a 4-star read, and there was a number of 5 stars in there. Why was it such a rich month? Various reasons, like buddy reads, recommendations from other readers, but also because 5 of the things I read were rereads for the Remember December rereadathon, and they were all books that I remembered liking or admiring, but couldn't remember that much about, and that's why I was rereading them. So that sort of up the chances of a high scoring bookish month. So the first book that I reread in December was this one, Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie, and this also kind of did dual service, because in the first half of December is the Christie's Missing Readathon, because it's the days in December when she did disappear somewhat mysteriously. It's still not entirely clear why she did and what happened. So there's a little readathon to sort of mark that. Rereading this, which is a Poirot novel from 1937, really reminded me of why Agatha Christie carries on being read. Despite elements of her writing being dated, elements of her attitudes, despite there being a plethora of detective and crime and novels out there, we keep reading Agatha Christie because she just does it so well. She knows how to construct a really effective mystery with some good red herrings, enough clues as to the outcome that you can sort of be halfway there at least by the time it comes to the denouement. She creates wonderful kind of characters that are both larger than life but reasonably convincing, and the plots convolutions may be a little far-fetched, but yet there's always a logic to them that makes it possible to follow. And this one is, of course, gloriously set on a sort of a boat cruising the Nile. So that's that thing of fixing it with a small cast of characters, a small group who can then all be variously suspected and have their varying different motives. Loads of atmosphere, lots of fun, and this edition was the original Penguin, so not a first edition of Death on the Nile, but when the first sort of paperbacks that came out by Penguin Books of Agatha Christie's novels, this was the original for this one. So that was a lovely start to my rereading month. Oh, now I'm talking, I've got a bit hot. Let's strip off. Next reread that I did was a little bit more surprising, I would say, and that was this, Redshift by Alan Garner. Now, this is a brilliant book, but quite a shocking one in a way. So it was published in 1973. Garner is a British writer. When this was published in 1973, it was sold as a book for children, or certainly teenagers. They didn't talk about YA then, but that sort of age group. I read it when I think I was about 11, and my memory of it was that I was really sort of quite shocked and confused reading it, didn't know what to make of it, and rereading it now I can absolutely see why. It's a very actually a very violent, quite disturbing story, beautifully written, quite a difficult style. It's there's 3 timelines linked by location. They all happen kind of in the same place, but one sort of at the end of the Roman occupation, one around the time of the English Civil War in the 17th century, and one sort of contemporary, just before the book was published, so like late 60s, early 1970s, and they're thematically connected, and there's a kind of a magical object, a stone axe head that appears in all 3 timelines. A lot of the text is sort of unattributed dialogue. You have to kind of work out what's going on. As I say, there's some very disturbingly violent scenes. I think, don't think of this as a children's book. Don't give it to a small child. I think if it were being sold now, as a newly published, it would be marketed as folk horror, I would say. It's a challenging read, but if that's your sort of thing, I would highly recommend it, and I would recommend Alan Garner generally as an author, and I will definitely go back to more of his writing. I read Trickle Walker by him just the other year, but yeah, interesting to say the least. Now, next 2 rereads were both Victorian classics, sort of a nice follow-on from Victober, in fact. Wilkie Collins' Moonstone and Thomas Hardy's Far From the Madding Crowd. I'll start with the Moonstone. This is something I hadn't read since I was, again, in my teens, I would say I last read this. I remember very little about it. I had tremendous fun reading it. It's pacey, it's energetic, it's 500 pages, but it doesn't feel like that. It's one of the earliest examples of detective fiction, but not in the Agatha Christie mode. It's more, I suppose, literary and novelly. It has a love story. It has some very interesting stuff about English attitudes to Indian religion and sort of the culture of their Indian possessions at the time. It was the time of the height of the British Empire. Was published in, let me check, 1868, and we get a sort of a series of, well, the way it's told structurally is interesting, because you get a series of accounts by different individuals that had a part to play in the strange, mysterious story of the disappearance of the Moonstone, a giant diamond that was originally stolen from an Indian religious site. And gradually through those different accounts, we piece together the story and come to a sort of a satisfying denouement in crime style, but also a resolution to the love story, and it's very atmospheric, and definitely a worth a read. One Victober maybe. Far From the Madding Crowd. Well, classic Thomas Hardy. You've got wonderful rural setting described in great detail. Tragedy, love, sort of characters that are sort of larger than life but completely believable. It has one of Hardy's greatest women characters, Bathsheba Everdeen, who's an independent spirit who's trying to run her own life and run her own farm, but is caught up in sort of relationships or potential relationships with 3 very different men. And yeah, it being Hardy, it sort of has some sort of huge emotional tangles and dramas, but a kind of, in some ways, a warmer resolution than some of his novels. Definitely, yeah, a 5-star read for me. I know I love Hardy, but I couldn't, because I last read this when I was in my teens. I wasn't sure whether it was as wonderful as I remembered, and yes, it is. I'm a Hardy fan, you know that. So, The next reread that I did was something quite different. It was an American book from 1927. The author is Thornton Wilder. It's the Bridge of St. Louis Ray. Now, this, I think it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1928. It's a very short book, but I think it was quite groundbreaking at the time that it was written in its sort of style and approach. I was really interested to go back to it because I was sort of blown away with it when I originally read it, and I still find it enormously impressive, although perhaps I was less amazed by it because, of course, I'd read it before. What can I tell you about it? It's set in Peru in the early 18th century, and the pretext for the story is that a rope bridge on the road between the city of Lima and the city of Cusco collapses, and 5 people are killed. And a Franciscan monk decides to look into the lives of those 5 people and kind of work out, was there a reason why God chose them to die, as it were. And Wilder uses that as a way to look at sort of Spanish colonial culture in the Americas, religion, but also it's about the fragility of human existence, the randomness of fate, are love and faith invaluable, or are they futile? There's a lot of humor in it. It's quite a sort of a degree of sort of exaggeration in the stories. If you haven't read it, you can read it in an afternoon, and definitely well worth your time. Lovely prose style too. I liked it a lot. Now, it was interesting that the other American book that I read this month was from around the same period, and that was Willa Cather's The Professor's House. Now, this was published in 1925, so 2 years before this one. And as it turns out, Wilder and Cather knew each other and admired each other's work. She was about 20 years older than him, but they met in 1926, so just in between when these 2 books were published, at something called now I've got to get this right, the McDowell Writers Colony in New Hampshire, which was a sort of a place that was set up for writers and musicians and so on to come and work, but also kind of cross-fertilize with each other. And it obviously worked because they met each other there and became friends, and had a lifelong connection thereafter. I buddy read this with Hannah of Hannah's Books, and Hannah and I had a discussion of it, which was recorded, and that video is available on my channel. So I won't say any more about this book in itself, other than, to just sort of think about the interesting parallels between these 2 books, in that, both Wilder and Cather were queer authors at a time when that was sort of known but not known, if you know what I mean, and it's interesting to see. There's a sort of a humanism in both their ways of writing that maybe reflects that experience. I don't know. She also won a Pulitzer, not for this book, but for another book in 1923, one of ours. I was pleased to kind of have these books adjacent to each other, if you know what I mean, and they're both ones that, as I say, I would recommend. Now, the other buddy read that I did this month was of this, and this is Gabriela, Clove and Cinnamon by Jorge Amado. It was translated by, it's one of those ones where you can't immediately, James Taylor and William Grossman. And it's a Brazilian classic, and it came out in 1958. The translation is a bit more up to date than that. I buddy read it with Brazilian booktuber Carolina, which was a joy because it's a much loved book in Brazil, and so it was great to read it with her. It's set in 1925, so around the same time as this one, in fact, and it's set in like a small town, a port in Brazil. It really exists, Ilhéus, just at the point where it was shifting from being a sort of a wild, almost like frontier sort of place where immigrants from Portugal and other parts of the world were sort of carving out cocoa plantations and fighting each other for the land, and also pushing out the indigenous inhabitants. So just at the point when it was shifting from that to being what they would have seen as a sort of a civilized modern town with different values, and that you needed to stop solving disagreements by killing each other, and it's full of humor. It's full of extraordinary characters that are both ridiculous and glorious. It's enormously pleasurable to read. The sexual politics are pretty sort of dodgy for 21st century eyes, but in the context of when it was written and the period that it was written about, I didn't find that a problem. Gabriela is a force of nature and an amazing cook. If you haven't read it, do. It's I can absolutely see why it's one of Brazil's best loved national novels. There you go. Now, the other book that I read that was a sudden fiction in translation this month was a much more up to date one, and that's Beyond the Door of No Return by David Diop, translated by Sam Taylor. This came out in the autumn of 2023, so hot off the press. It was published in France in 2021, and the rapid translation of this reflects the fact that Diop's book At Night All Blood Is Black won the International Booker in 2021 and was a big international bestseller and a really wonderful novel. Now, At Night All Blood Is Black, I remember reading in sort of one sort of feverish sitting of sort of shock and overwhelm. This book's quite different, I would say, and if you're kind of expecting that, you might be disappointed by this one. I'm not saying that I was disappointed by it. It's slower, it's more complex, it's more reflective, it's not quite so sort of mad and extreme. It reflects the fact that Diop, who's from Senegal, is now a French academic, and his area of study is 18th century French literature, sort of from and about the French colonies in Africa. So, that's his areas of study. And it's actually based on the life of a real life French botanist, Michel Adanson, who went to Senegal in the middle of the 18th century and did sort of to study the flora, and did write about it. But this is a sort of fictionalized version of his visit to Senegal. But actually, and this is the glory of the book, it's sort of multi-layered in that it's his story about that visit as recorded for his daughter to find and read. So there's sort of layers of what is truth, what is story, what's true about his motivation and his, is he accurately reflecting what he did when he was there or not? It looks at French colonialism, it looks at slavery, it looks at the sort of life and culture of the people of living in Senegal at that time and their interactions with the French and with the slave trade. It's sort of a love story. It's sort of a mystery. It's sort of a journey. It's as I say, a complex and interesting book, and a really good translation. I liked it a lot. It wasn't, At Night All Blood Is like, it's one of those books that if you liked it, you loved it. Whereas this is, a little bit more subtle but satisfying. Now, the last 3 things I'm going to talk about are a book of nonfiction, a book of poetry, and then I'm going to wind up with my top novel and number 1 read of December. So the non-fiction I don't have because it's a library book and it's gone back to the library, but it was Lost Realms, Histories of Britain from the Romans to the Vikings by Thomas Williams. It came out in 2022. Now, this was a very satisfying book for me to read, but it's probably of limited interest to most of you out there. Unless like me, you are fascinated by the sort of what used to be called the Dark Ages in Britain. The little kingdoms that grew up as the Roman Empire sort of shrank back and the Romans left, or some of them did, and as the Anglo-Saxons started to arrive, and then up and until the Viking invasion sort of shifted things again. And he looks at several of those kingdoms, and the source material is limited, so he's sort of he's wonderful in writing about this in an engaging way, sort of drawing out what he could from the source material, referencing it thoroughly, not making sort of wild guesses or suppositions or over romanticizing the period, but just the glorious little details and so on. What's interesting, of course, is that part of the problem about us not knowing enough about that period is that the things that were written by those kingdoms, that people from the kingdoms that grew and succeeded and pushed these other ones out of existence. So like Bede, who wrote History of English-speaking people, English peoples from Northumbria, which became one of the big ones. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles that sort of reflect the sort of Wessex and Mercian sort of ideas of what happened, and I really interesting, but only if you're into that sort of thing. Now, whereas this completely different story, poetry, yes, and not something that I read all in December, but this was like December 2023 was a milestone for me, in that it was when Toulouse-Lautrec came to the end of an amazing journey through all of the sonnets of William Shakespeare, with a series of wonderful videos unpicking each sonnet and the language, the themes, the humour, the bawdiness, the emotion. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that William Shakespeare is a great poet and a great writer, but if you would like to explore all of Shakespeare's sonnets, I cannot recommend highly enough doing it in the company of Too Tight, and will be eternally grateful for the sonetarium and the journey it took me through all, how many? 154 sonnets. There you go. And that finished in December. So, last book of the month. Now, this was the last book I read in 2023. It's but I think that it is going to be one of my top books of the whole year, and I will be making a top books of the year video next weekend, I think. But right now, let me sing the praises of Orbital by Samantha Harvey. Now, this came out in December, I think, beginning of December, and so brand new, hot off the press, short novel, only about 130 something pages. Quite extraordinary, I think. Now, what it is well, it follows one day in the lives of 6 astronauts living on the International Space Station, and it's sort of 24 hours and 16 orbits of the planet, which we spend with the 6 of them. Nothing really happens but everything happens. You know what I mean? It's not a book that you read for plot, okay? If plot is what you look for in a novel, ignore this one, switch off now. But if you're interested in character and ideas and beautiful writing, then run out and get hold of this book. I almost question whether it's a novel. It's more like a kind of a meditation on life and humanity and human relationships and our place in the universe, I guess. As I say, nothing happens other than the little episodes of their day, the sort of prosaic details of living on the space station, and some bits of backstory about their lives as through their thoughts and their feelings and their tiny bits of communication with their families. But above all, it's and we get a sense of what they do up there and what it's like to live on the space station. But predominantly, it's about that thing of looking down on our world and the different perspective that gives you about life and the planet, and then the different perspective that we get from reading this, talking about that. I don't know that I've decently explained why that was so delightful. It was like an exercise in mindfulness reading this, I suppose. And I read it over the space of a few days. I mean, one could read it all in one go, but I didn't get to do that because I was having a very challenging few days travelling to and from a funeral of someone very close to me. And this book survived being read in those circumstances and actually helped sort of sustain me through those, a few difficult days. So, that's part, I suppose, of why I loved it so much. But, the prose in this is absolutely immaculate, I thought. So there we go. Have you read it yet? If you have, do talk about it. And any of these things, if you've read them, I always like to hear other people's comments and reactions and, your best books of December too. And I will be back as I'm sort of getting myself together again after, as I say, a tricky few weeks with a review of the year and, my best books of 2023, probably two videos worth, one about new fiction and one about everything else. So see you soon.